All right, so I think we'll get started. Sorry that the last panel ran a little over. I think someone was a little confused, but it's okay. So I'm really excited that we have a lot of our CCLers here today for this extremely important panel. As some of you, most of you probably know by now, I'm the outreach liaison for CCL as of January. And as soon as I started, I realized that CCL has a lot of work to do with our conversations and relationships with environmental justice organizations. I'm really excited to announce that we're going to have a new environmental and climate justice action team that's starting officially with Marty Roach, who's in the front row here, is going to be heading that.
4 of us here.
4 of us, great. So we're really excited. And because we're starting this new group, and in order to ensure that its goals and direction are productive and respectful, I really wanted today to be a look at the landscape of environmental justice and to hear from some incredible speakers and organizations about what they see as the most important aspects of the fight for climate justice and how each of their different groups are approaching that. I'd really like to come away from today with a more deeper understanding of environmental justice work, why it's so important in the movement, not just for climate equality, but for every type of inequality that needs to be addressed. And I'm hoping we are going to hear from our amazing panelists where they see the climate justice movement at now, where they see it going in the future, and what the major issues they see are. So we're extremely fortunate to have some incredible people on this panel, and yeah, I'm going to introduce them. So first we have Leslie Fields. She is the director of Sierra Club's Environmental Justice and Community Partnerships Program. She was formerly the International Director of Friends of the Earth, and she's currently an adjunct law professor at Howard University School of Law. She serves on the Joint Center for Economic and Political Studies Commission to engage African Americans on climate change, the American Bar Association's Environmental Justice Committee, and on the board of Horn Relief. We could give a round of applause for Leslie. Next to her, we have Khalil Shahyd. Khalil is the project manager in the Urban Solutions Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Khalil works to increase utility-funded energy efficiency programs targeting the affordable multifamily housing sector. In addition, he's leading NRDC's outreach and coordination of affordable housing partners to advocate for efficiency investments in the EPA's Clean Power Plan. He has an MA degree in Sustainable International Development from Brandeis University and a PhD in Energy and Environmental Policy from the University of Delaware, where he's developed a specialization in urban political ecology. And last but not least is Kari Fulton. She's an award-winning environmental and climate justice advocate, organizer, writer, and cultural historian. She's worked with various domestic and global coalitions to coordinate campaigns, leadership development programs, and conferences, including PowerShift, which is the largest youth climate summit in the United States. She's traveled across the US, Europe, Latin America, and South Africa, attending and reporting on international environmental conferences. Most importantly, Kari is a mother, partner, and bike enthusiast. She's a graduate of Howard University's John H. Johnson School of Communications and a longtime Washington, D.C. resident. And Kari is leading Empower DC's growing environmental justice work. All right, so I wanted to start with each of you giving us a short update on your most recent work on climate change in your communities. Maybe we'll just start with Khalil. And I think the mic there, yeah.
Good afternoon. This is really loud. Okay, so thank you for having me and allowing me to come and talk. Before I talk about my work, it's important to understand and for me to include this caveat. I, as was mentioned in my introduction, I'm a project manager in the Urban Solutions Program at Natural Resources Defense Council. So because of that, because of where I'm placed, because of the work that I do and the way that I do it and who I do it with, I don't have any claim to doing environmental justice work. The the people, the leaders, the communities, the organizations, institutions who are at the forefront and who are leading and who are doing the work of environmental justice are grassroots, are on the ground, unless they're like Leslie who are able to do that. But the work that I do, I like to identify myself as an ally to the environmental justice movement and an ally to the work that environmental justice communities and leaders are spearheading. But I don't claim to take that work on for myself through my institution. That being said, the work that we do through the Urban Solutions Program, we like to think of ourselves within this giant institution that is NRDC as bringing environmental solutions, bringing climate solutions actually down to communities. And so as NRDC, has some of these great environmental victories and huge policy wins, regulatory wins at the EPA and the federal level, within Urban Solutions, our initial question is, what does this look like in implementation on the ground? How does this actually impact and how does this work in our communities? How can we begin to transform our communities in a democratic way through green neighborhoods, retrofits, through greater transit, access, livable communities? How can we begin to grow and enhance our communities at the neighborhood scale to be more environmentally sustainable? And so how can we implement these solutions there? And some of the work that we're doing, as mentioned, we have increased over $100 million across 12 states in the US, increased spending by electric utilities on energy efficiency retrofits for low-income multifamily housing. We're working through our Green Neighborhoods project with communities such as Watts in Los Angeles, my own neighborhood, the 7th Ward, 6th Ward, Claiborne Avenue in New Orleans, doing local community redevelopment and green scale retrofits in a way that avoids the common and the coming trend of environmental gentrification. We are working with partners and allies such as the Sierra Club and many others in the Clean Power Plan to ensure that the Clean Power Plan is established and implemented with considerations for equity and justice at the forefront, and that includes through the distribution of investments for renewables and energy efficiency. It also includes ensuring that as the Clean Power Plan is implemented, that environmental hotspots in EJ communities are not just sort of happenstance or created out of that process. And that's working with, again, multiple partners, both national, but also local environmental justice organizations, equity-based organizations, and many, many others. We'll stop there.
Awesome, thank you.
Oh, good afternoon, and thank you all for this invitation, and thank you all for the work you're doing. And I'm delighted to be here with two very dear friends, and I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you all, and I hope we just have a really good conversation. Our work is really, it's become a calling, actually, and because just as Khalil said, I'm very blessed and lucky and work very hard in this space because I get the best of both worlds. I love EJ so much because I get to work and meet and be with the best people in the world. I'm here with you all. I'm here with my friends. And this really is the most important thing I think going on right now. It's about communities preserving their communities for future generations and their kids, and for the planet. So we started our environmental justice program back in the 90s, and we were very intentional about it. We really took to heart and created principles, which I highly recommend doing if you're going to start this work. Based on the 1991 People of Color Leadership Summit, which happened here in Washington, D.C., 17 principles for environmental justice were promulgated, and you can Google it. And the number one principle, being a Trekkie, Star Trek person, this is very serious, that the people speak for themselves. That is the prime directive, okay? So we created our program and communities requested organizers. So we've had place-based organizers for a long time in some communities. Some communities we've had to leave due to all kinds of budget or political issues. But I'm proud to say we've been doing this for a very long time. And climate has been always at the forefront, no matter where the communities, whether it was in the Navajo Nation or New Orleans or in Memphis or in Puerto Rico, where we are here in DC. I've lived here off and on I bought my house in 1991. I've moved to other places. I came back, I rented my house out. And Washington, DC is full of neighborhoods, as Kari will tell you. We've had impacted neighborhoods. We have neighborhoods that are really suffering here. For a lot of people, it's just to come in, go to a meeting. I would encourage you all to get out and look at some of these beautiful, beautiful places that we have. And also, as I'm going to talk about later, that in order, I think, for this work to succeed, we have to understand, and we have to understand that our liberation is tied up with everyone else's liberation. If you think this is a single issue thing, and that, this is just one add-on to whatever, whereas this is really the prime directive for many communities, I don't think we're going to make it. So we have to our program has become, I think, very nuanced in terms of understanding we have to work on other issues. We have to work on the issues of those communities. We developed a democracy initiative at the Sierra Club. We're working on voter suppression, campaign finance, Senate reform, all right? We've got, because we understand that for the people that you all want to vote for this stuff, they better be able to vote for this stuff, okay? And if we don't get serious about what's coming up in this election, those other people, they don't win, they cheat, okay? And they cheat in these communities most impacted about what we're talking about. It's all connected. And so we try to work with that and we have many, many kinds of allies and partners. We have 63 chapters. It's a very big, large, complicated organization. But we really are trying, and we've had to centralize this in our organization, just like we've had to do it externally. So it's been challenging, and it's also rewarding. It's not easy to sit in this space as a professional woman of color in a majority-white organization and try to get this done in a real intentional way, because the structural racism and all the things that have happened have been intentional. It's not been an accident. It's not by osmosis, okay? It's been intentional. So to undo this, you have to be intentional. It's not going to just happen because it's a nice thing to do. And it's getting late, right? So we are trying to do that in our program. Right now, for example, we have a fantastic chapter in Puerto Rico. We're dealing with the debt crisis as we're dealing with climate, as we're dealing with the government trying to put in a control board over to Puerto Rico so they can take back the lands that we help preserve in Puerto Rico, okay, to help preserve the Northeast Ecological Corridor, for the leatherback turtles' nests, more about turtles I've ever wanted to know in my life, okay? but they're going to try to get that land back to the developers because it's all about paying off the bondholders. But it's actually destroying their democracy. They're already a territory. They're going to be back to a colony with a control board. Just like we had a control board here in Washington, D.C. When we had our control board, we had our lead in the water crisis. When there's an emergency manager out there, guess what? There's going to be a lead in the water crisis somewhere because of infrastructure and these disinvestment in these communities. So we have to, and I encourage you all, you really have to incorporate this stuff and understand that these communities are dealing with, you've had your good educations, you've got your good housing, you've got your good representation. Some of these people are still working on this stuff, right? And they certainly care about this. And they know about climate. They have the worst asthma rates in the country. They understand. But they're still working on making sure that the refinery isn't going to expand in their neighborhood. And at the same time, there's a mass incarceration problem, and there's police brutality, and there's all these other things. And then when they try to go vote, you can't figure out where your polling station is, right? And all they have to do, because I do voter protection too, all they have to do, I went back to my hometown, Cleveland, yes. Yes. Okay, in Cleveland, they sent us all the broken voting machines last cycle to the black precincts. So all you have to do is start that line forms out the door. People got to go pick up their kids, you know? People can't stand in line for 3-4 hours. So every precinct loses a margin. That's how you lose Cuyahoga County, okay? No Republicans won without Cuyahoga County. No Republicans won without Ohio. I'm just saying. So we have to look at this in the totality, and that's what we try to do in our program, as much as possible. And sometimes it doesn't happen, but you have to be intentional about it and meet people where they are. We have lots and lots of partners. You know, one of the most important ones, unions and labor, and I can talk more about that later. So I'll pass this off.
Oh. Oh. Here, come up here. No? Yep. Are you sure you don't want this? Oh, no.
That's okay. That's all right. You know, I'm kind of short, so I was like, I have to. Can you see me? That's a better question. Just my barge hair. Okay. So one of the things I think is really important here in Washington, D.C. So I started off as a youth organizer, just fresh out of college, working on environmental justice and climate justice, and I literally don't know how or why, but the gods aligned and put me right where I need to be. So when Leslie talks about how this is kind of like your chosen work, I think that is very true. A lot of the people who work on environmental justice find out early on that it is the epicenter of all things. Anything that you were already working on, whether it was climate, whether it was social justice, housing rights, all these different things connect back to environmental justice. And then you have climate justice, which is a whole nother aspect of that same coin. So locally, I want to talk about what's happening here in Washington, D.C. Recently, I started on with Empower DC. Empower DC is a community-led, member-based organization here in Washington, D.C. And they started out working on housing rights and education rights. But later on down the line, a lot of their work, they realized, was connecting back to the environment. So one of the main campaigns that they've been working on for a while now is in the neighborhood that I now live in called Ivy City. So Ivy City, has anybody ever heard of that? How many people live in DC? Not about 1 or 2 y'all. How many people have been to DC more than one time? Okay, so if you're ever traveling down New York Avenue and you're going to get on the highway, like you're going towards Baltimore because you got to go catch your flight to BWI, you might see in the distance on the right a big old Hex warehouse. You might also see a big sign that used to say love because it was a nightclub over there. You might see some school buses. All of that is the neighborhood of Ivy City, which was mainly zoned for industrial use for a long time. So you have a lot of distilleries over there. You have school bus depots. You have Metro, who has a bus depot, but you also have community over there. So in the midst of all of that, the community was fighting for a community center. So in the midst of all this, there was no community center. And through a long, heated process, we've gone through several different mayoral administrations. One administration wanted to tear down a historic school that was once a school for African-American students called the Cromell School, tear it down and make another bus depot in an already disadvantaged community that already had several bus depots, highway entrance, you've got other situations going on. And we had to fight back. So that was something that Empower DC led, to fight back against tearing down a historic property and turning it into yet another bus depot in an area that already has high asthma rates and other aspects that are going on. And they won for the most part. And that was amazing. That was a major environmental justice victory on a local level. And it's still something that we're continuing to fight. But on this level now, prayers up, put all your good energy, because now we're working to take over that space, to actually bring the rec center to where it needs to be. We're writing proposals, fighting with, well, not fighting, but we're competing against some other corporations who want to take the space and put more gentrification entities. Because for a lot of environmental justice communities, we can't separate our fight to clean up our neighborhoods with the fight to stay in our neighborhoods. So for Ivy City, in the midst of all this fight, the only reason that they really won, the reason why Muriel Bowser, our new mayor, said she's not going to tear it down, is because that neighborhood has tremendously changed. So now you have, in an old Hex warehouse building, you have high-end real estate, you have condo buildings, you have Mom's Organic, you have Planet Fitness, you have Bikram Yoga, you have CrossFit, all of these things in this neighborhood now, So if you have all this going on, I don't think you want to build a bus depot next to high-end condo buildings. But we also have to make sure that the low-income community that's there gets a chance to stay where they are, where they've historically been, where their families are in that same space. And that's a part of the growing conversation of where our environmental justice organizing is moving towards here with Empower DC and in Washington, DC overall. The current campaign that we are leading with our environmental justice work is in a neighborhood called Buzzard Point. How many people have been to a baseball game here in Washington, DC? A couple of you all? Did y'all know that's the first LEED certified green baseball stadium? Yes, there's a community not too far from that baseball stadium called Buzzard Point, and it's right off of the Anacostia River. You have boats that park there at the Buzzard Point Marina. You have organizations like Earth Conservation Corps that have been working with the wildlife and also with the community. And you also have public housing residents and private residents that all live in this neighborhood. You also have, this is also an area that was zoned for industrial use for a long time. So you had salvage yards, concrete yards, and now they want to build the most expensive Major League Soccer stadium in the history of Major League Soccer, on top of what was once the Buzzard Point power plant. So in that process of building this, you're going to be digging into the ground about 10 feet in, excavating some of that land. So all of that land is going to come up, and you already have fugitive dust coming from Superior Concrete, Vulcan Concrete, DC Rock, but you're going to add whatever toxins are coming out of the land from the Buzzard Point power plant former location. They're also going to be building the largest substation in Washington, D.C., the Waterfront substation, that'll be connecting transmitter lines underground to the former Buzzard Point substation. The reason you're building the substation is because if you build a soccer stadium, you have the baseball stadium, you have about 3 new mixed-use retail condo buildings coming up all in this area, you're going to need a little bit more power, right? So just a little bit, right? So in the midst of all that, the community, we didn't just go over there. Like Empower DC didn't just read the newspaper and say, we're going to go over there and figure out what we're going to do for you. This is something that the community members came to us and said, hey, this is going on. We need your support. And that goes back to what Leslie said. The community, the people, they have to speak for themselves. I can only move as far as the community wants to move. So if the community says this is where we want to stop, as an advocate, I have to say, well, that's where we're going to stop. And sometimes that can be a heartbreaking feeling, but you have to realize that part of this is not your fight. You have to be able to know the boundaries. If you're coming in as an ally, because a lot of times, sometimes allies come in and they want to tell people what they think they don't know. And that's not always the best thing to do. So as we're moving forward, what the community has stated that they want is, one, they want protection from whatever toxins are in the ground. We've been working with the Department of Health that is supposed to be putting out a community health and safety study. That was supposed to be done the last week of May. It hasn't come out yet. We've also been working with a variety of different university organizations who've done health impact assessments, who have broken down the voluntary cleanup program plans into layman terms, who have helped to build websites for the community. We've done tours for allies. So we're continuing to grow this campaign and to work with the community as they prepare for the remediation that's going to be happening sometime in September. Where we are with that is finding every different way that we can fight back. What are the ways that we can do that? We have to get as creative as possible. We're looking at what can we make a historical district? Because in the midst of all this, as I mentioned, you got Major League Soccer, condo buildings, you have retail, hotels, public housing. How do we make sure that the public housing residents, the truly affordable low-income housing, is allowed to stay within this community once all of this development encroaches on that space? And sometimes we have to partner with the wildlife. There's a episode of The Daily Show, I'm not going to go too far, but if you've ever watched it, they're talking about Turkey Creek, and one of the groups that they worked with was the Audubon Society. So they were able to protect their community because there was a migratory bird that traveled through their community. And they were able to save their community because they needed to save this space for this endangered migratory bird. So the comedian who was a part of that sketch went around the mall and dressed up in a bird outfit to see if he could get a better reception than him being an African-American male. So he actually got a very good reception as a bird. But that's one thing to consider for this community, because it's right off of the Anacostia River, which at one point was one of the most polluted rivers in the country, and there's a major plan to clean up that river. You do have species that are going to be impacted and are already being impacted by this development. All of these lights, any type of night wildlife, they're gonna really be impacted by that. It'll mess up their whole sleep habitation process. We already have a lot of rodents that are coming up into the community because they're already doing excavation for the substation. So that is impacting the community as well. So there are lots of ways that you can plug in and that we want you to join in. We're also thinking, what does this have to do with climate? Well, there are emergency preparation plans. There are issues with natural disasters that have to be taken into consideration. If you're talking about all this construction at one time period, they're also going to be fixing the bridge, the South Capitol Street Bridge, which is a major highway infrastructure out of the city. Those are all things that we have to consider when we think about an increase in natural disasters, an increase in extreme weather patterns for a community, and it is a riverfront community. So we would love to continue building with people who want to support this very important fight here locally in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
So I think if you guys have note cards, if you want to start writing any questions you have, just off the top of your head. The interns will take them and bring them to me. In the meantime, you sort of touched on this, Kari, but I think getting some more examples of how you partner with groups in ways that help your work. I think that would be really helpful for some of us to hear some really concrete examples of that.
Yeah, sure. As I said, it really needs to be intentional. And one of the business partnerships that we have a labor program. We have a labor economic justice program. We, the Sierra Club co-founded with other organizations like NRDC, the Blue Green Alliance. And that's an extremely important alliance. Our labor director, Dean Hubbard, is the co-chair of it. And we are and Khalil mentioned we're working on the Clean Power Plan with many groups. We're very concerned about the issues of the worker transition as we are transitioning from a fossil fuel economy to a clean energy economy. Renewables are inevitable, but justice is not. And we really have to pay attention of the people who are going to be left behind. The New York Times had a big article yesterday about the coal miners in the Powder River Basin. And we have to look at the false solutions that are being promulgated in these communities, such as prisons, because they're private prisons, that feeds the mass incarceration problem we have. Our prisoners here in DC, we don't have a prison here in DC. Our people go to 25 different states, okay? And so that means that they are not able to really keep in touch with their families, and they come back and they have real recidivism problems. So it's probably about feeding the beast here. It is connected to climate. There's actually a prison ecology project looking at building up prisons in environmentally sensitive areas and how these prisons pollute the communities in these areas. And they just had a big event June 5th. So we basically work with communities who invite us in, and communities that we have been collaborating with for a very long time on different issues. And, and so whether it's the Black Nurses Association, we just were at the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists Conference that was here 2 weeks ago. The CBTU has been around since the 70s. It is 70 union members from the AFL-CIO, and these folks have been doing environmental justice for over 20 years. They have what's called the CARA teams to make sure that their workers, initially it was about making sure their workers were being safe, working with toxics, working with the Oil and Chemical Workers Union on worker safety and the fence line communities. All this stuff is transitioning into climate, and people understand that the health, the impacts on their communities, the water problems. I mentioned Puerto Rico. I mean, we're working with many communities in Puerto Rico because now they're under threat from the Zika virus, all right, because of the mosquito population exploding over there because of climate change and climate disruption. The Zika virus is here in the continental United States. And so we have to make sure that people who've been involved in the health community, in the faith community, in the labor community, in the small business community, we're working with as many people as we can, particularly in the renewable energy industry, but we have to make sure that the renewables and the solar companies, some of these solar companies are anti-union. Some of these solar companies use prison labor. Yes, they do. And so we internally, my labor director, Dean Hubbard, and our team, we're working really hard to make sure our organization, in the rush to get excited and partner with renewable companies, that these companies have principles. We did a big action in Paris. Dean put together a wonderful panel because Nissan Renault, which is a co-sponsor of the Paris COP, operates in Canton, Mississippi, the plant that makes the battery for the Leaf electric car in Canton, Mississippi. That plant is 85% African American. They will not let them form a union. Don't just take our word for it. The National Labor Relations Board did an investigation and filed a complaint. We cannot leave one exploitive fossil fuel economy and go into this renewable exploitive economy. So we're working with the UAW on this. Anytime anybody puts a major facility in Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, it's a race to the bottom for those states because they're right-to-work states, they're anti-union states, and communities are so desperate to get something, from these companies. So we have to, I hope you all really look at these renewable companies as well. As Alden Meyer, my friend, said, there's other regulations have to be in place. The other thing about communities and different partnerships that we have is that it's important to reduce the carbon. We have to also be about reducing the criteria co-pollutants in these communities. It's going to be very hard to partner with these folks if they only hear about reducing carbon, because they are also in this toxic soup of cumulative impacts. What we really need, I think, and the holy grail for the next administration is a cumulative impact standard. Okay, we're going rule by rule by rule. We've got an SO2 rule, we've got a methane rule, we've got this rule, we've got a clean power plan, and we really need to get at all these impacts, mobile sources, stationary sources, like my favorite place in Detroit that's got the Marathon Refinery in 48217 that has the Ambassador Bridge with 5,000 cars and trucks a day coming from Canada. And there's a school, there's another bridge being proposed, there's the incinerator, there's the sewage treatment plant, there's the Severstal steel plant, there is the there's the coke piles, there's about half a dozen other things in this one zip code. They don't have a grocery store, okay? That's not a food desert, that's apartheid. Okay, that is deliberate. That's not a natural occurring condition. Oh, it's a desert, That is a deliberate discrimination, segregation, redlining of a community. And this is what I'm saying. You've got to be intentional. I applaud you all for developing now a new environmental justice committee, but this stuff has to be intentional to undo this intentional stuff that's happened. And we can't get everybody, we can't just care about, all right, we're going to take carbon out of the atmosphere when they've got all kinds of other pollutants coming at them as well in this toxic soup. And that is how we've been successful working with communities, understanding that all this stuff has to be considered. And because that's their living truth.
Okay, so what we're doing in relationship to partnerships, I think, the big thing is, again, as I mentioned, with our Energy Efficiency for All project, which is addressing energy efficiency in low-income multifamily housing. So that project is across 12 states and is a partnership both nationally but also individually in each state with affordable housing advocates, tenant organizations, environmental justice groups, equity organizations, developers, building owners, to really address and to drive more investment for energy efficiency into low-income housing. And part of that also is in how do we get these new constituencies to be much more engaged and have much more access to the utility regulatory environment process at the state level, which is essentially like going into court. And you have to prepare for it like going into court. So how can we make this process much more open, much more democratic, much more friendly to public engagement, to public participation in utility policy, in utility regulation, as we are trying to manage how we grow it and how we feed our energy demand. So that's probably our largest. And then, as Leslie and Kari mentioned about, working with EJ communities and being invited into the space, our Green Neighborhoods work operates under the same principle. And so we never go into a neighborhood and say, hey, we can propose a new development strategy for your community to make it all nice and green for you. It's always by invite. The work that we're doing both in Watts and in New Orleans. For example, I just so happened to run into a friend of mine who's working for the mayor's office, who's doing a redevelopment project in a corridor of our old neighborhood. And she, was mentioning to me the work, and she says, yeah, we got this cultural development plan, we got social development, economic development, but there's no green. Can you help us to make this project a sustainable one? And so that's when our Green Neighborhoods team comes in, and we say, okay, this is what we can do in terms of green infrastructure, help you think about transit, park, and open space, and some of these other amenities and initiatives, but it's always going to be by invite. And one other thing I wanted to say, because I thought Kari brought up a really good point and a question, what does climate have to do with injustice? And the thing about climate is symptomatic of these many other issues. And what concerns us about climate change, if you're thinking about, extreme weather events, be it a tornado or a hurricane, if the worst fears of a household or community under these events is either losing power or literally losing your home. But if you are from a low-income community, if you're from a marginalized community, if you're from a community of color, those are fears that you kind of live with each and every day. Having your power turned off because you can't pay the bill, or getting kicked out of your house because you can't pay the rent. And so losing power, losing a home, those are everyday mundane oppressions that many of us go through all the time. And climate change will just exacerbate those. It will sometimes spread them to a wider proportion of the population, but the deepest impact is going to be on those folks who are feeling it in their everyday mundane lives. And so that's what climate change is, and that's why injustice matters, should matter to the climate movement, because that's essentially what it's about. And how do we protect against those impacts? How do we mitigate them from ever happening? How do we adapt to the new reality that we are ushering in through burning carbon? How do we shore up resiliency from further impacts? And how do we make communities whole again? And one thing that you're hearing, and again, and this goes back to what Leslie mentioned, one thing that you're hearing is this buzzword about transition. Transition is great. We like the idea, but it doesn't actually get at what EJ groups are really trying to do. It doesn't really get at what EJ communities actually need. Transition doesn't necessarily speak to labor rights to organize. Transition doesn't necessarily speak to the experience of workers of color of being discriminated against in the labor market, of being crowded into low-wage sectors. And so for those communities, they need much more than a transition, because many of us were never fully integrated into the industrial economy to begin with, so there's nothing to transition from and to. And so the approach has to be much more holistic. It has to be much more rooted, in the reality of our communities. The last thing I'll say on that is, I try to, and again, positioning myself in NRDC, which is one of the biggest green organizations in the country. So my approach to this work has to always be mindful of where I am and how I'm situated. And so, coming into this work, as NRDC, carrying, that banner into this work, there is a parable from an ancient Chinese philosopher, and he was asked by this emperor, this king, what is the best way to rule? And the philosopher said, for you should sleep half the day so as not to hurt the people. And so the message that I bring from that to our work, to my work, to NRDC, is that sometimes we should just not do anything, that we should just listen. Okay, and we should come into this work as allies and be willing to be open and be willing to listen and to respect the voices that are speaking to us. And so that's the first thing. Because if we can't do that, then we're not really getting the message. We're not really being true partners. We're not being true allies, and we're never going to see the victory that we hope to achieve.
Yeah.
I think my co-panelists have brought up some very important points, so I really don't know how to follow that. But I think one thing that's important in our work is definitely we work on cross-sectoral issues. So we have a housing campaign, and we have a community campaign that works on supporting mothers in public housing. And to see my other organizers who really didn't have that much understanding or experience with environmental justice, and they're starting to get it through the work that we do as an organization, that helps to strengthen our organization. There's also going to be a strong fight because our mayor, one thing that she said that triggered me a little bit, because it just reminded me of Keystone XL, was when we went to the demolition day, they had a demolition day, and we went out with community members who are sitting right, literally smack dab across the street from where they're building the substation. And we wore dust masks, and we had signs. And we're telling them, like, we need to do something about the pollution that's already here. This is going to bring more pollution. We want to breathe as a community. And our mayor and the city council member refused to even drive past the protesters. There was only one exit out, but they went in their large luxury SUV and found another exit out of the demolition area. And one of the things that she told the press, the media, was, well, any development in this neighborhood is good for the community, and we're gonna bring 1,000 jobs. And we're gonna work with the community so that those jobs are targeted towards Ward 6 residents. So that was the trigger, because I was like, I've heard that before. Isn't that something they said with Keystone? They're gonna bring all these jobs. So. But if you're talking about jobs working on a toxic former industrial site, or you're talking about temporary jobs at a soccer stadium, are those really jobs that we should be sitting around hooping and hollering for? And that's the part that I think is important for all environmental justice organizations to remember, is that there's somebody who needs a job. And if they can say that to people, it's because there needs to be more opportunity out here for people to have good jobs. When Leslie's talking about how crazy it is that they're doing all this in Mississippi and Alabama, and you have these green corporations that are basically fundamentally treating their employees like crap, it's because they know that somebody needed a job. And the luxury of us being able to sit in this room at 4:30 in the afternoon and talk about climate and energy and carbon plans, I think is something that should never be taken for granted. Because the community members, I would have loved to invite a community member to sit on this panel, but at the end of the day, they gotta go to work. And they take their time out from their lunch break, from their Saturdays, to fight for their community. And that's something that pushes us even further to find how we can support as much as possible. So remembering to connect back to labor as much as possible, because the people who are going to be working on that site are just as impacted, if not more. And Leslie went on a tour with us. We went and toured the Buzzer Point where they're doing the construction. And the people working there are Black and brown people. That's who's going to be impacted right now. The same people who live in the neighborhood, but they might not live in that neighborhood. They live somewhere else. But it's the same people that you have working on those grounds are the same people who are going to be impacted first and worst by the pollution, and who are going to be, hopefully not, but who, they intend to displace once they turn it around and turn it into the eco district, right, that the Office of Planning has prescribed for the Buzzard Point community. So.
Go ahead.
I just want to say something to that last point about the jobs, because too often we think of jobs, is it a good job or is it a bad job? It's just a job. As long as it pays a good wage, it's just a job. A job is more than that. A job is your livelihood. It's part of your identity. And if you don't have the right to choose what your job is, then what people are saying too is you don't have the right to choose your own identity, your own livelihood. And so when a mayor or anyone comes in and says, well, we're going to give you a job, they're really stunting you and taking away your right to choose. I was at a forum a couple years ago, and I really wish that I could do more work on this sort of nexus between reproductive justice and environmental justice. And the difference between reproductive rights movement and the reproductive justice movement is that the reproductive justice movement is not just about the right to choose, But it's also, but it's about the right to choose, but also it's about the right to be able to choose what type of life you want for you and your child, a life that you and your child have reason to value. And so, and that speaks to so much more, than just a job, whether it's a good paying job or not, but it's about you having the right to choose your own destiny, to choose your own livelihood, to choose your own identity. And that's really what many of these communities are actually fighting for. And it's the same story where you're talking about Buzzard Point or Keystone XL, but it's also the same story. We see it every day in urban communities when we talk about gentrification. And they say it's either gentrification or there's nothing. That is the only option that you have, is gentrification or nothing, or just continued persistence, poverty, and underdevelopment for your community. And they're really saying you don't have the right to choose your own destiny, your own livelihood. I just want to say that.
Thank you, guys. So we only have about 5 minutes left, but there's some really great questions. I wish we could get to all of them. I think what's really resonated with me is that the idea of listening, which CCL, we're really good at that with MOCs, and I think we can get better at that with other organizations and really listening to their concerns. And on that note, I'm trying to sort of combine these, but what would you say is a good way for us as CCLers to approach? I know you talked about being invited into a community, but if you really want to get to understand their issues and maybe, like you said, get a tour of somewhere that's really important to an organization or what they're fighting for, what would be a good way to sort of approach them without coming off as not intentional?
I think it's really important while you're listening to also, like I said earlier, to support those other issues that they're interested in or working on, okay? I'm not saying CCL all of a sudden do death penalty, okay? I'm not saying that. But I'm saying something like voting, which is important to you all too, right? So relevant issues, and since this is election year. I would also suggest starting on the ground. If you're looking at national organizations, everyone wants to get with Jackie Patterson, our dear friend. I would suggest getting with the local NAACP chapter, and then their state conference. They have the same rubber chicken dinner every December, the same place, same time, okay? And starting to get to know those folks, and she's doing an amazing job educating her infrastructure. She's doing all these sessions on energy justice right now. People are very sophisticated and are working on these and many other issues. So I would say start where you are. It's where I started. I started with all the local places that I was living in when I was moving, and then I came back here. And the tendency is like, get to the top, you're in Washington, D.C., go to the CEO or somebody like that. So that's where and then where they are. And it takes a while. As a wonderful pastor told me, you have to move at the speed of trust. All right, and so that is, it's just because you show up 1 or 2 times for the cleanup doesn't mean that now you can, jump on them. Hey, can you do this with us, kind of thing. So it's developing relationships like everything else, but the intentionality of what those communities are doing, and then also the small business community, and who are also very important allies, particularly minority entrepreneurs that are trying to get into the renewable energy space. Also really good allies like our friend Gilbert Campbell with Volt Energy, and our friend Donnell Baird with, what's Donnell's group's name? Block Power, who are doing all these great retrofits. And also in the rural areas, the minority farmers who've been trying to hold on to their land, who are now fighting fracking, all those community groups, where those associations are, whether it's their churches or, start right there.
Yeah. So if you are interested in getting involved in what's going on or learning more about what's happening in Buzzard Point, you can email me, and I will add you to our listserv. So my email is Kari, Kari, at empowerdc.org. Kari at empowerdc.org. I'm going to try and stay as long as I can after the panel. Unfortunately, I do have to go to another event. But yes, we want to continue building, and we need people who can call people, and we need people who don't mind getting on the phone and yelling at our city council members every once in a while, especially if you live in Ward 6, which is right by Capitol Hill, or if you have friends that live in Ward 6, right by Capitol Hill. So.
Where to begin? I would say, just to concur with what Leslie and Kari said, one thing I would add, I think is very important, again, and what I said throughout this presentation, I hope is to really own, the place where I'm coming from, working through NRDC, and so to really own, your own identity, the own space that you're coming from, and not try to represent yourself as as something other than that. And I think with that, and just sort of speaking to the obvious, there are 3 persons of color, on this panel. I'm sure many of the other panels in this conference haven't looked like this one, speaking to an audience that is, majority white, not person of color. And one lesson that I took, from my early years as an organizer, my uncles and some of my family came up through the Black Power and the movement and the Black Panther Party. So I was really influenced by the works of Huey Newton, which is not a word which was not a person's name that you're going to hear in many of these settings, but I'm going to say it here because he's one of the most brilliant political philosophers in the history of Western civilization. And so, he wrote an article and essays speaking about the split between he and Eldridge Cleaver. That I think one of the lessons from that is really overlooked, and I think is very important, and I wouldn't want you to leave here without it, is one of the things that Eldridge Cleaver tried to really do with the Black Panther Party was to really move their alliances to a lot of the white left and white radical groups of the 60s, which is great. But Huey said, but those groups didn't give us access and relationships to the white mainstream. And so we remained sort of isolated in this conversation. And so, and that is very, very, very important and should not be overlooked as white allies in these movements, whether it's for racial justice, climate justice, any kind of justice, is your role in making sure that the white mainstream is a part of this conversation and not just rebelling against it, not just backlashing against progressive movements, progressive victories and advances, but that we continue to carry this conversation and continue to carry all segments of our population forward, that we do not allow people like Donald Trump to be considered viable presidential candidates in our modern society, just because we have not been able to bring a very large proportion of the white mainstream into a much more progressive vision of our future. They've been for so long external to that conversation. And so, I just wanted to make sure that we are deliberate about that role and that aspect of our conversation here today as well. And so it's not necessarily your fight, as Kari mentioned, for you to organize or to bring benefit to communities of color, but to be allies. But part of that role in being allies is to make sure that they are not isolated and we're not isolated in our struggles. Thank you.
All right, so it's 5:34. I just wanted to announce that Marty has signups for anybody who's interested in joining the climate action team, and thank you all so much for coming. I think I learned a lot, and I hope you guys did too, and we'll continue this conversation.